father of the House of Commons and Conservative MP for Worthing, has been campaigning for action on cladding. Peter, good evening. Why has it taken 3.5 years to get to today?
I think you need to ask the government that. It's well over 3 years ago, I think it is, that I said to government, you've got to get people together, realise who's eventually going to have to pay up because they have criminal or civil liability for this complete unsafe disaster, and say, how are we going to get through it? In the same way, in a slightly different context, the fire courts after the fire of London got London rebuilt within 10 years. We need to get these homes made safe within a year and a half. We need to make them saleable so people can move on with their lives. And we need to make sure that the money is provided, and who pays in the end should be settled in time by courts and by inquiries, but it should not be the innocent leaseholders who in effect are only tenants by law. They're the only tenants being asked to pay for the outside of their buildings, and it's wrong.
Now, this $5 billion will be used to replace cladding, but there are many, many other costs that the leaseholders will have to finance, and yet they're not getting any help with that.
That's true. And the cost of insuring the buildings, which leaseholders pay for, even though they don't own the buildings, they are literally only tenants. And remember, they're the only tenants being asked to pay. Social tenants don't have to pay. Private tenants can move off at the end of their agreement. It's only the lease renter, the leaseholder, who's being stuffed. I think that we have to recognise that insurance has gone up by 6 to 10 times for very many of them. They've got the cost of waking watches. We know who are those included in those responsible. They include the builders, the developers, the cladding manufacturers, the surveyors, the architects, the insurance companies who cover the professional liability of all this. I reckon if you said to each of them at the round table, if you pay up £2.5 billion each over the next 5 years, we won't pursue you through the courts. I reckon they would.
But why has that not been done by now? As I say, we're 3.5 years on. You would have thought that might have been one of the first things that the government looked at.
Iain, you may not be as mature as I am, but you're wiser. You've known it some years since I was a minister. When I was a minister, I used to get people together and say, how can we solve this problem, preferably without the use of law or courts, and we'd normally get it solved. My wife is barracking me at the side. She was a more senior minister than me. She said,
We're getting a unique insight into the Bottomley household this evening.
I get advice from her. I sometimes take it.
But in the end, there are people. I mean, we're going to speak to somebody who's been affected by this in a moment, and it will have ruined lives. There will be people who've had to put their lives on hold, their family lives on hold, through no fault of their own. Now, it is difficult because this sounds an enormous sum of money, but there will be people who say, well, look, this is taxpayers' money. We can't afford to put another $5 billion into this. Somebody else has got to step up to the plate. Now, you're saying, well, that should be the builders, developers, whoever. Well, fair enough. Let's hope that they do, but they've shown no sign of doing it so far.
I think I'm saying something slightly different, or in a sort of Peter Bottomley rough and ready way. First of all, let's agree that the leaseholders are the innocents in this. Secondly, let's agree that their homes need to be made safe urgently. Then let's agree they need to be made saleable, or else you freeze a large part of the housing market. In the end, in the medium term, what matters is the cost of the interest on the borrowings or the finance made available. And that's where the government's present advisors, I think, have been quite imaginative. And they say government can borrow or can back borrowings at interest rates of 1% roughly. Private people couldn't do it for less than 3 or 5 or 7 or whatever the figure may be. So you can cut the cost of the interest down a lot. How that interest is paid for is a separate argument, and government have said in effect they'll carry the cost. But it's the cost of the interest that matters rather than the capital sum. Then I think you have to say, where can the money come back from in the end? And Robert Jenrick has quite wisely said that some of it can come back through levies and taxes in the future. That doesn't close off what happens now for those who are by their leases liable, but in all justice should not be. I think that when Robert Jenrick said something about caveat emptor, that might apply to someone buying a home in a floodplain or liable to subsidence for coal mining. Even there, I think people often step in and help. I think what government's doing now is welcome. I don't think it's enough, but I think it's a jolly good step forward, and it's one that I will for more as we have to in watching those who are taking competitive advantage. If you take those insurance premiums, government takes 12% in insurance tax, they take 20% on the cost of the cladding, and you've got to give that back and recycle it. And I think we ought to say that the Competition and Market Authority should watch what the insurance companies are doing, because these premiums, in my view, cannot be justified at the levels they're now being demanded.
Peter, thank you very much indeed for joining us. That's Sir Peter Bottomley, father of the House and Conservative MP for Worthing.